Hello, I'm Justin Wheeler, and welcome to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit. As a nonprofit, you know what it means to put your heart into something. Like, you know. But when it comes to missions of the heart, your board may not see it as clearly as you do. Today, we'll get both perspectives. Luke Womack is an executive director with passion, while Pat Mullen is a board chair on a mission. I'm talking to these Go Fund leaders to discover how they found their footing together and uncover their secrets to board efficacy. And the best part, what Pat and Luke deliver is stuff that every nonprofit can do. You don't need a big board budget to build relationships, ask the tough questions, or recruit the people who have proven their care and interest in your organization. What you need is a board who's willing to show up. Listen as Luke and Pat channel their inspiration and motivation into no budget needed actions designed to take your board from barely breathing to fully functioning. Let's dive into the episode. It is your number one priority to ensure that your business can continue to deliver on its mission, whether it's this year, next year, and beyond.
I'm always so baffled when I do webinars. There's always somebody at the end who raises their hand and says, I'm the development director. Should I have access to the budget? I'm always like, yes, you've got to know that.
The best thing that we can do is just raise as much money as possible and then give it to the people around the world.
If you're going to be sustainable, you have to have a multi-channel strategy to reach all of these different generations of donors however they want to be reached.
The best thing you can ever do as a nonprofit leader is spend as much money as possible on your story.
And it snowballs like any peer-to-peer campaign. The more people that view this content, the further and further it grows.
Then you're doing it wrong.
Okay.
That is unacceptable, and that is not the way to run a board.
The more nonprofits can give their donor base that experience of the impact that's being made on the ground level, there's nothing else you have to give someone. This is Nonstop Nonprofit. Hey listeners, welcome back to Nonstop Nonprofit. Today I'm excited to have two guests on the podcast, and the conversation is going to be about the dynamics of an executive team and how they interact with the board and vice versa. And so a while back, I posted something on LinkedIn. And I'm going to read that real quick just to kind of set the backdrop for today's conversation. This is what I wrote. I'm going to say this for the nonprofit board members in the very back. Get out of the way of the executive team. Your role is not to control. And if you aren't donating expertise or money or raising funds or introducing your networks, you don't belong on the board. Stop using this as a status symbol and start adding value or make room for someone else that can. Posted this on LinkedIn, and Luke, the executive director of the Go Fund, responded, and we had a great conversation, and he had a great idea to actually bring their board chair, Pat, who is also on this episode, to the conversation so we can talk about this a bit more. So Pat and Luke, welcome to the podcast. How are you guys doing?
Doing great. Glad to be with you.
Yeah, doing great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to have this conversation today. I think it's an important conversation for nonprofits and for board members alike. Before we jump into that, I'd like if you both could give us a quick introduction. So, Luke, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you landed and became the executive director at the Go Fund.
Yeah, thanks. So, I graduated from college about 10 years ago with a degree in business administration. Honestly, always thought I would start a for-profit because when you have a business degree, that's what you do. You definitely don't start a nonprofit. I think I don't love the terminology because obviously we still seek to make a profit. We just distribute funds to back into the mission, not to ourselves. So in any case, that was never really the plan. But just wanted to do something with my life that really mattered. Starting a for-profit, obviously, it can really matter a ton in the community. But saw this angle that really made sense for me. Given my skill set and even lack thereof in some areas, just wanted to learn how I could help missionaries get overseas to places who had no access to the Bible. And realized student debt was a major issue for a lot of my peers who wanted to do that. If you don't know about missions work, it doesn't pay super well. That's not why people get into it. On average, we pay about $5,000 a year for missionaries, looking to go places, take the Bible where it's never been. So thought that was pretty meaningful and started from scratch in 2014, and here we are 7 years later doing the same thing.
That's awesome. I remember meeting you. I think it was at some event like early on when you were just getting started, and so it's been really cool to see the growth and just the clarity around your guys' direction as a nonprofit. So congrats on building it. It's not easy to build a nonprofit. It's much easier to build a for-profit. From my perspective, I've done both, and I think nonprofit is just much harder. So congratulations there, Pat. As the you're the chairman of the board at the Go Fund. Would love to hear your story as well, how you got involved, and what your role looks like on the board.
Yeah. So I guess it was 6 or 7 years ago. Our friends were telling us that they were going to this vision dinner for an organization. So I thought I should rescue them from this Ponzi scheme they're getting involved in. But they kind of described it, and they were like, no, it's they're paying the student debts of missionaries. And so my wife and I were kind of intrigued, but thought maybe they were selling soap, or we were just kind of came with a skeptical eye. But yeah, we went to this vision dinner, and Luke got up and kind of explained the idea of this organization that was gonna pay student debt, the loans of missionaries who were committed to going to these unreached people groups. And we were just super compelled by the idea. They had 3 sets of missionaries up on the panel that they interviewed and said, hey, if you donate tonight, we're going to put that money directly towards those missionaries. So we were super compelled, became what the organization would call champions, but just donors that night. Just continued to give for a few years, and then just had a different level of interest, I guess. We didn't. Yeah, I was always asking Luke, because the organization had this 100% model where 100% of your donations go to the actual cause, and I kept asking, well, how are your how's the actual operations getting funded? And Luke and I kind of became good friends, and so he was just like, yeah, we try and raise those funds separately. And so then we started wanting to give directly to the operation sides of things, just because it was like, wow, that's like the lifeblood of the organization. And, the organization is going to die if the operations, the funds aren't there for that. So, yeah, I think just giving through that, Luke saw, we're more engaged than maybe people who kind of come in the front door and want to give directly to the program. So he invited me onto the board, and within, I think, a year, he approached and just said, hey, I think you might be a good fit for the board chair position. Would you be willing to do that? And I didn't know, it was my first time ever being on a board. So let alone to go from board to board chair, I was like, wow, I have a lot to learn, but if I kind of put my trust that if you think I'm going to be a good fit, I'll give it a shot. So yeah, 2 years later, I'm still learning, but happy to do what I can to help.
The benefit of coming in with fresh eyes is you don't have to unlearn all the bad habits that we've created in the boardrooms of nonprofits. And so I love that you came in fresh with fresh perspective. Also absolutely love that we need more donors in the nonprofit space that look at sort of operations in the way that you described it. It's the lifeblood of any organization. An organization is going to make significant impact. It needs to be well funded operationally. And so I can see where this conversation is going to head in a very positive direction, just with that type of a mindset. And so excited to kind of dig in here. Luke, a while ago we talked on LinkedIn about the dynamics of a well-functioning board. And you mentioned that you have a very strong board. In fact, you look forward to the board meetings, and it wasn't always that way, you admitted, but you guys are in a place now where it's functioning the way a board should very productively. So can you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean by that? What does a well-functioning board look like in your perspective? If you could shed any light on that, that'd be really great.
Yeah, honestly, I did it the wrong way for a long time. Like I mentioned, I've been leading the Go Fund for 7 years. And I would say the main thing that allows us to have a well-functioning board, it comes right back to board member recruitment. And, there are a lot of different things I could talk about, but I think it's really all about recruiting the right people. And I think often well-meaning executive directors or CEOs get this wrong. They really want a great board, but here's what they do. They look for titles. They look for the CEOs, the CFOs, and the CPAs, and they try to fill their board with experienced people Now, that can work really well, but it can also significantly backfire. And the reason that backfires is because you have a bunch of people on your board with a ton of success and big titles, letters in front of their name and behind their name, but they don't care about your organization. And that becomes a huge problem because you don't have their hearts, right? You have their heads, but you don't have their hearts. And these are not the types of people who are going to bleed for your organization. And so what we look for more than anything else, and it's maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but first we're going to look for people who have demonstrated over time that they have a deep care for the organization, irrespective of the title that they hold. Both is nice, but if I could pick one all day, it would be people who have a deep care for the organization. And I can think of like 5 must-have qualities that we're looking for in board members. There's nice to have qualities, but the must-haves are those that if these aren't there, there's no way we would ever let them onto our board. So here are the 5. Number 1, you have to be connected to the organization. I just mentioned that a moment ago. That's kind of the overarching quality. You have to have a demonstrated interest in the organization before you're nominated. So it's not like, hey, I'm looking for a board member role. I'm shopping a bunch of different organizations. Like, you've been connected to us probably for a number of years. And that brings me to the second thing. This is kind of evidence of that, if you will. You have to be a current donor. Like, we don't allow anyone onto our board who hasn't been giving to the organization for at least 2 years. And that's really painful sometimes because we'll have people, become new donors. They've been a donor for 6 or 12 months. And I think, gosh, I'd really like them on the board. But we're looking for longevity, people who are sticking around. So you got to be a donor of record at least the last 2 years. And there's a principle that comes out of the Bible that I think really fits here. It comes out of Matthew 6:21. It says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I think it's really true. Where people put their money, that's where their heart is also. And where people put their heart, that's where they put their money. Like, those two really connect together. So we're looking for people who invest, not just with their hearts, but with their dollars as well. Third thing is availability. I know it sounds kind of silly, but you got to be able to attend meetings. I mean, if someone is too busy, too involved in their career that they can't show up to a meeting, I get it. But you'd probably be a better personal advisor, maybe not a good board member. Fourth, valuable skill set. I mean, we're looking for someone ideally who has some skill set. Maybe it's finance, maybe it's fundraising, operations management, something that they can bring as a gift to the board. And I'll mention this too, in terms of the kind of strengths makeup. I don't know if you're familiar with StrengthsFinder, but one of the domains is strategic thinking. Like, more often than not, we're looking for people who have strategic thinking strengths, right? Strategic thinking is all about making better decisions, and the board is there in part to help me make better decisions. That's one of their functions. So we're looking for someone with a valuable skill set. And then the fifth thing, which is especially relevant in 2020, 2021, we're looking for charitability. Like, we're looking for people who are known as good group decision makers, which is tough. People who will show up to the meeting, lay down their swords, be willing to defer to the group, and express their opinion, but also do what's best for the organization, even if the board disagrees with them. So I would say those 5 are kind of must-have qualities, and building a great board. I think it all comes back to recruiting the right board members.
Wow, yeah, no, those 5 qualities are spot on. I love that, and I want to kind of piggyback a little bit on this concept of strategic thinking, right? Because I think this is one of the greatest contributions a board can make. Is around being a strategic thinker for the organization. An example of when I was running Liberty in North Korea, we were expanding our programs, and one of the programs we wanted to expand to, there was a lot of risk. We were operating in parts of the world that it was literally life and death sort of situations, and instead of the board pushing back on expanding in these areas, which were absolutely necessary, instead there's like let's have a conversation around protocols and policies that will help mitigate sort of potential risk. They became like thinkers and helped, kind of strategize. They didn't try to discourage or say, no, sorry, this is just too much risk for us, right? And so that type of strategic thinking, I think, is the most value. And Pat, I wanted to ask you, as the chairman and as someone who's been on the board, do you feel like you guys have enough space, whether it's in board meetings or other opportunities, to really be strategic thinkers and partners alongside Luke and the executive team?
Yeah, I think when I first got on the board, our board meetings are limited time, so the way ours work, 4 hours every quarter. So at first it was like, the first 2.5 hours were being devoted to like kind of like updating the board on what's taken place since the last meeting, kind of getting through some of the bureaucratic sides of things. And then we'd kind of shove the strategic thinking space for maybe like an hour at the end. Or we were just filling our meetings with just a lot, just too much stuff. We'd have a list of things that we want to get through, and it was like, man, we have 10 things we want to get through, and we're going to rush and try and get through everything. And we weren't having like really meaningful dialogue at the beginning. So yeah, one of our board members said like, hey, if you can anything that can be read in advance, don't do in the meeting. Like the financial reports, like, yes, we need to look through the financial reports, but send them out in advance. That way we're not like digesting them in the meeting. So anything you can digest ahead of time, like do it, and we can do quick votes in the meeting. And then the other thing that we did is, rather than starting to, like, Luke would always update the board on, hey, this is what happened since the last meeting. And it was valuable to us, but it would fill up a lot of space. And so we said, hey, like, let's do a like quarterly update before the meeting, like something that people can read, and we'll send that out. We'll kind of get all of that out of the way. And so now we have like 3 solid hours of our meeting is devoted to strategic thinking, and we'll pick at most 2 topics. So we'll have like, an hour to an hour and a half of really kind of unpacking one topic. And that has made a world of a difference in our meetings. We have so much time to just have space to think, not feel rushed to get through the topic. And everybody really contributes well. I'm trying to understand who has what strengths inside the meeting. So sometimes I'll ask questions like, hey, what do you think of that? Or, hey, if you were to be devil's advocate, like, how would you poke holes in that to try and, get some good conversation flowing? And Luke's great at that too. So to answer your question, like, our strategic part of the meeting is like 3 hours, and it's awesome. It's awesome.
That's awesome. And Luke, when you and I talked earlier, you talked about, the way sort of like it used to work was, it was you talking for the most part, for the most of the time. And then like the last, however, many minutes or whatever was kind of carved for like bigger conversations, which there was obviously never time. That, with boards that I've been a part of too, that's very much been the case. I think I've been on the other side of the boardroom, on the executive team. And like we have this sort of like desire to make sure that our board knows everything, especially all the good things that we've accomplished in the last quarter, right? We kind of treat board members to an extent as donors, and we're still trying to like show our best. When we really optimized our board was when the board actually saw the underbelly of the organization, the challenges, the complications, the big questions that we didn't have answers to, but at times early on we're too afraid to bring them to the board because we were like, oh, is this going to discourage their interest in the organization? Are they going to have less confidence in the leadership? But when we take a step back, we said, no, this is exactly what the board is for. This is exactly the expertise that we're looking for. It totally changed the dynamics. Sounds like your story is similar. So maybe if you could share a little bit, from your perspective on how you identified that in your board meetings, and then how you transitioned to this more strategic meeting approach.
Yeah, like Pat mentioned, I had a board member who approached me after a meeting one day a couple of years back, and she said, hey, I just want to be straight with you. The board meetings are really bad. And this is out of love, right? Faithful are the wounds of a friend. So she wounded me, but she did it for a reason. And she said, I can help you, but we got to sit down and talk about it. And effectively, it was what Pat was saying. It was, hey, we're not here to listen to you. We're here to help you. And if you're just going to get up and talk and give us an update, send us that via email. Like, we want that stuff, but we're here to solve problems. And so we shifted to kind of like a post-mortem perspective. So you've heard of a pre-mortem, a pre-mortem perspective. You've heard of a post-mortem. That's like, when someone dies, you're doing an analysis of what was the cause of death. A pre-mortem is like, if the organization was to die or just suffer some type of loss, why would that happen? How would that happen? And how can we prevent that? So we're talking about potential issues before they happen, instead of just reporting on good stuff that's happened in the past. So that's shifted a ton. And I think a big piece of that, Justin, is trust. So trust is simply confidence in someone else's character and their competence. And so building relationships with the board is critical. So I want to harp on this real quick. I think one of the primary jobs of an executive director is to spend time with individual board members. So if the only time you're seeing board members is at meetings, you're doing it wrong. My target is to visit in person or virtually, in person isn't possible, to visit with every single board member once per quarter. And that's outside of the board meetings. So that takes a lot of time. I would say, executive directors, CEOs need to be spending maybe 20% of their time on board related activities. And here's what that does. When I stand in front of the board and I'm giving an update, I'm doing a presentation, I'm participating in a conversation that our chair is leading, I can be honest with them because we have a relationship. I know that they have confidence in me, I have confidence in them, because we've already built the relationship outside of the meeting, not just for the 5 minutes before the meeting starts. So that's a big piece of it, is developing good trust so that you can be honest in your reporting.
No, yeah, that's great advice. I think a lot of times board members, they kind of get the assumption from the leadership team can often be, oh, they're pretty invested, like they sit on the board, so I don't need to cultivate these relationships like I would maybe with some other, major donors and so forth. And so, but again, like when you have the opposite of a well-functioning board can be a detriment to the organization. It can slow the organization down. It could slow its growth. And so, it's definitely developing a board that's high functioning is definitely a growth mindset, right? It's going to help the organization grow. And Pat, so from your perspective on the board, what do you see in Luke or other leaders that gives you the confidence to continue in your duties, right? Because I think like there are times when like it could be hard for a board member to either leave an organization, maybe when they lose confidence or lose faith in like the leadership. What does Luke and his team do that instills confidence? You've been around for a while. You start off as a donor and have continued to get more and more involved. So what is it about Luke's leadership that gives you and the rest of the board a lot of confidence, keep on, showing up to the board meetings and going above and beyond?
Yeah, I'm trying to think back, like just from starting out as a donor, like what attracted us to the organization to begin with. And it was, Luke was so intentional about, number one, spending time with the people who were connected to the organization, whether it was even just like a small connection, a small donation, or like something, that more significant. He would personally reach out to everyone that was getting connected to the organization. If you sent a donation in, it was like, man, he's on the phone with you. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. It's a card in the mail. Thank you so much. Like a handwritten note. Like my wife and I have given to other organizations, just because we're like, wow, that sounds like a great mission that they're doing. We never hear back from anybody. Nobody ever contacts us from the organization. So it's like, there is so much intentionality of connecting with everybody who's a part of the organization. And it really makes you feel like, wow, you're in this big family together. And we've never had that experience with anybody else. So yeah, I would say that's probably the largest thing, is just his ability to connect with people. But then, secondly, he takes criticism so well. He's hungry for criticism. So, it's not like some CEO who kind of has a hot head and says, hey, I got the ship taken care of. Like, don't worry about what I'm doing. Kind of stay out of my, like he is constantly like, hey, where are the flaws in this thinking? Like, poke holes in it. Like, let's put the idea over here and let's all attack it with our best shot and see if it can withstand. So he's not getting offended at the criticism. He's really welcoming it.
It sounds like, that's a lot of leaders that I've talked with and have worked with, that like the fear of that vulnerability, it can be perceived as a weakness. Right. And so a lot of leaders just kind of like, like I've got it figured out, I'm leading the ship, I'm going to make the calls, that type of thing. But really it's just like, leading with humility is I would argue one of the strongest positions you could lead from. And it looks like that's exactly what's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
As most of our listeners are nonprofits, are executive directors, CEOs. We do also have board members that listen as well. And so for those that are listening and they're thinking about, all right, as we go into 2022, as we think about the next year, we want to really develop and optimize our board to be the best functioning that it can be for our success. So any advice that you would give to help executive directors and board members alike just to be able to drive the organization through a better, well-run board?
Absolutely. I would say a couple things. Number one, clarity on roles. I think one of the main reasons that executive directors and boards get in trouble is you don't know who's doing what. So here's the deal. You have the same objective. It's called the mission, right? You just have different roles. It's like a coach and a quarterback, right? The coach never actually steps on the field, even though he wants to win the game, right? But he and your quarterback are meeting on the sidelines talking about the game, but then they have different roles, once the clock starts. I've heard it said before about board members that they are to keep their noses in the business and their fingers out. And that's really how Pat operates and how our board operates. They're kind of sniffing around to see, what is it that could go wrong? What is it that maybe already is going wrong? But when it comes to operations and getting your hands dirty, they let the staff take care of that. And that's really refreshing, and it builds a lot of trust. So in terms of, the board and the executive director relationship, I'm really the liaison between the board and the staff, right? It's really an hourglass structure where the board's at the top, I'm in the middle, and then the staff reports to me, and they really respect that. They're not jumping, down, talking to the staff. The staff isn't really talking to the board. Sometimes that happens just for relationship building, but there's a lot of clarity there. So I would say this, in terms of the functions of each role, and Pat has really helped me see this, and he's offered clarity in the relationship. But board members really do three things. They, number one, protect the mission. Number two, they hire and evaluate the executive director, that's me, and they ask tough questions, right? So as we're sitting down in a meeting, their primary thing they're doing, they're protecting the mission. Is this on mission? Is this mission drift? They're evaluating me. They're asking me really tough questions. Like Pat mentioned, if I'm resistant to that, that makes their job really hard. And then the evaluation of the executive director is going to be pretty bad if I'm not listening to them. On the other side, the main functions of an executive director, I'm in charge of building a team, raising resources and fundraising, ensuring the operations are excellent and smooth, and helping to fulfill the mission. And once Pat and I saw, hey, we have actually distinct roles that are both important, it really helped smooth the gears for organizational growth. And in terms of my relationship with Pat, we should be spending more time together than I spend with any other board member. So Pat and I meet every other week. So that's 24 meetings a year. And yeah, we're walking through, board agenda preparations. He's checking in on me personally, seeing how I'm doing, asking about unique challenges in the organization. So Pat knows more about the organization than anyone besides our staff. I mean, he really is in tune with what's going on day to day, not because he's getting his fingers in it, but he wants to be able to report back to the board on what's going on and lead the conversation well. And I'll finish with this. I've heard it said that the number one threat to an organization is, and this is going to sound peculiar because you think of 100 other things before this, but I think there's something here. The number one threat to an organization very well could be lack of communication between a board chair and the executive director.
That's good. I definitely have seen the breakdown of that happen on boards that I've been a part of. And so that's I've never heard of that saying before, but definitely I can definitely see the strength of it. The other thing I wanted to comment on was just the thing you mentioned at the top of the response, which was around clarity of roles. Right. And this was something like about 2 years ago, board that I sat on, we went through this consultation process, how to just better serve the organization. And one of the biggest sort of takeaways was this whole notion of clearly identify each board member's role, whether it's committees or a specific function. And what happened after that was established is the board started meeting outside of board meetings, right? To talk about the specific things that they were working on. And so when board meetings came, it also allowed board members to be much more collaborative because they were having conversations on the side that were sparking, other conversations and questions and so forth. And so the clarity of roles is so important. It keeps the board on track in their lane, if you will, to really operate the way that they should. Pat, give you a few minutes as well to respond to that question and any additional insight that you have.
Yeah. So I wanted to give a few really tangible things that I feel like your listeners might be able to glean from. So number one, I would meet bi-weekly with your executive director, if you're in the board chair seat, like that relationship is so critical. So the more often that you can meet as the board chair and the executive director, like form that relationship. Like Luke and I are good friends outside of the organization, which helps. It helps immensely. But if you don't have a friendship necessarily with the executive director, like meet often and form a relationship with that person. Secondly, I would read this. This was so huge for me. The Board and the CEO by Peter Greer. That is where I got. I mean, Luke was the one that suggested it, but it's where we found, hey, what are the three functions of the board? Because being on the board, I'm like, what do I do? Like I've never been on a board before. Now I'm in the board chair position. Like I don't know what value I'm supposed to bring to the organization. And he makes it so clear that it's those three things. It's protect the mission at all costs. So like anything inside a board meeting, like that is our focus. Is this mission oriented? What is the mission about? Hiring and evaluating the CEO and asking the tough questions. So during that strategic discussion, like really poking holes. So that's at the top of our agenda. That's what we put as, hey, here are the three things that we do here in this board meeting. And so we need clarity on that role as the board. I would say to your listeners, like evaluate your agenda. If you're not enjoying your meetings, take a look at your agenda and figure out like, what are we spending the most time on and what's really wasted, and how can we get that out of the meeting and maybe in some sort of like a month, a quarterly update, or maybe it's an email that people can just respond to, but try and get like as much waste out of your meetings as you possibly can so you can focus on strategic discussion. And I'd say the last thing, and this is something that Luke has come up with, but it's been it's been an amazing tool, is he comes up with his own scorecard, and he says, here are the things that I am going to get done this year. And it might be a list of 10, 20 things. It's, hey, I'm going to meet weekly with my executive team. I am going to meet, monthly with 20 donors and have a personal relationship with 20 key donors. So he has a very tangible list of, here are the things that I'm going to do this year. And at the first meeting of every month, we go through his scorecard, Luke and myself. We look line item by line item at that scorecard, and I put a 0 if he missed it and an X if he got it. And so every month we're tracking, hey, are you getting done the things that you've committed to the board that you're going to get done? And we get to keep him accountable. And that makes it, at the end of the year, we get to reward him or give him a slap on the wrist. And fortunately, we haven't had to do that. So, so if you can come up with a scorecard of like, what are you going to get done as the executive director, and submit yourself to be accountable to the board, I think that would go a long way.
That's great advice. Great advice. The accountability, that what I love about that, obviously, is just the accountability to the goals that have been set. But what I also love is that, Luke, I imagine it with your team, are setting those goals. And it's not the other way around, where like the board, who doesn't have like the day-to-day knowledge of like what's going to be the most impactful, right? Because I've seen this a lot of times, boards will set goals for the executive team and they're just not aligned with internally where the organization is actually going, which is a problem in and of itself. But I love that the ownership still falls on the executive team to make the goals, to understand this is what's going to drive us closer to the mission, and the board's there to support and offer help and so forth. So that's great advice. All right. So, Luke, another question that I've thought about, and I think we discussed this a little bit as well, but the role of the board chair, right? I mean, there's all sorts of different roles that board members play, but I think the board chair is obviously a very important role. And so can you help us understand why that role is so important, and also like what makes a good board chair? Like what are their core responsibilities from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there are really a couple different stages of organizational growth. There's kind of the movement stage where the board works for the executive director. And that's pretty typical. That's how most organizations start. The executive director is this, visionary, and they're kind of sharing about the organization and selling at board meetings in some ways. But then it shifts to less of a movement and more of an established organization where the board is working with the executive director And that's a stage in which I think everything shifts and you really can run mature board meetings. And for me, the primary shift that happened when we kind of moved away from the movement stage into the organization stage is instead of me leading the board meetings as the executive director, the board chair was leading the board meetings and I was showing up as a participant. Like that shifted everything because it communicated to the board that the board chair is the leader of the board and the executive director is the leader of the organization. And that really helped me be accountable to the board. It really helped the board to drive board centric initiatives like developing a board policy manual and, hey, how can we work with the CEO, not simply work for him, if that makes sense. And I would say a couple of things that are unique about Pat, our board chair, that really helped me to lead well and serve the board well is primarily he's empowering. Like Pat is a wonderful leader, and the main reason is he's empowering. So he's not like trying to control me. He's not getting his fingers in the business. He gives me a ton of space to do what I think is best for the organization. And man, his default answer is yes. So when I share ideas and thoughts with him, he does everything he can to say yes. And obviously he says no sometimes. Hey, I don't think that's a good idea, or that's high level enough. We should take it to the board. But he gives me a really long leash. I would say he's empowering. He's also really teachable. Doesn't claim to have it all figured out. He's constantly growing, rapidly applying feedback, listening to input. So at the end of every board meeting, we do a board meeting rating. So every board member goes around and rates the meeting 1 to 10. And that's primarily an evaluation of the board chair because he's leading our meetings. And, when we started doing that, he was getting, 6s and 7s. And now most board meetings, now that he has, a bit of experience, he's getting 9s. I think he got a 10 the other day. So kind of putting these in place, applying some of these practices, he leads stellar board meetings that people actually love to be a part of. And I would say the last thing that makes Pat a really good board chair is that he's really confident and self-assured. It never feels to me like he's competing with me for attention. He's fine letting other people be the hero, and he's certainly not like seeking an identity in his board chair title, but he really cares about the organization deeply. And that's one of the things that makes him not just a great board chair, but a great board member as well.
That's great. Pat, what real quick here, what's the difference between a 6 and a 10 board meeting? What, how do you go from 6 to 10? Like what's the secret sauce?
It was not trying to crowd the meeting space with like so much garbage. I mean, might be important stuff, but it was like, I had like the 6 meetings, it was, I filled the space so tightly that there was no room to breathe. And the 10s are, I reluctantly pulled all of that stuff out of the agenda and said, it's not super important. Like maybe it is important, but like maybe we'll accomplish it through some emails. And I took so much out of the agenda where it was a little bit uncomfortable. Like, wow, we're going to probably wrap this meeting up in like an hour, and we're going to have 3 hours and people are going to think it's a waste. And those have been the best meetings when we've taken so much stuff off the agenda and focused maybe on 1 or 2 big strategic topics and just had a ton of breathing room for people to think, not feel pressured to move to the next item. And those have been awesome meetings.
And Pat, I would say the shift was from tactical to strategic. So previously the conversation was tactical. Those are like low level questions, action steps. It's like, hey, what financial appeal should we make at this conference, or what venue should we pick for, a meeting? It was less of that, and it shifted more to big picture strategic issues like, hey, should we add another program? Or, hey, should we align strategically with an outside organization? Or do we need to change our mission statement? Like those are 2 to 3 hour conversations. And anytime he leads, I would say the bigger the strategic topic that he's leading, the higher the meeting rating is at the end. Like that's what board members want to talk about, is these big picture strategic conversations. And he does such a good job of bringing those in and leading the conversation well.
That's great. And I think those conversations are easier to have in that type of setting, to your point, when the chair is leading it, because they're not going to be like so inundated with the day-to-day of the organization, right? That's not going to be what's on top of mind. They're going to be thinking 1 year, 2 years, 3 years out And so it's gonna be a lot more conducive to those types of conversations. The best, when I think about like my experience on a board, the meetings that I walk away from, I'm like, man, that was the best meeting we've had. It's when everyone is participating, when everyone is talking, when everyone's collaborating. Right? I've been in plenty of board meetings where it's been the opposite, where it might just be the ED talking for the majority of the time, and so that definitely resonates, from my own experiences as well. That's super practical feedback for those listening. I would really encourage you, if you're an ED or CEO that's running your board meetings, give it a shot. Like, talk to your chair. If you don't have a chair, nominate a chair and have your chair take on the meetings and see how that changes the dynamics of your board meetings. Again, Luke and Pat, thank you so much for your time. It has been such a pleasure speaking to both of you. Good luck with taking the organization to the next level, and I look forward to seeing the growth in many years to come.
Thanks,
Justin.
Have a great one. See you guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit. This podcast is brought to you by your friends at Funraise, nonprofit fundraising software built by nonprofit people. If you'd like to continue the conversation, find me on LinkedIn or text me at 562-242-8160. And don't forget to get your next episode the second it hits the internets. Go to nonstopnonprofitpodcast.com and sign up for email notifications today. See you next time.